debt ceiling, balances, and timeline. We also have a request to address the board to this agenda item. Mr. Joe Nolan, would you like to come speak to this item?
Excuse me, I'd like to see the presentation so I know some of the things that I'll be asking about. That's all right.
Okay. Mr. Walmer, you have the floor.
Thank you. Members of the board, Dr. Boyle, good evening. Tonight, I'll present some information to clarify some of the options that we have for our bond program that have been created by, number one, our long-term plan, property assessed valuations in the district, and legislation. And you'll see that we have a decision or two to be made in the coming weeks. You should have two attachments besides the PowerPoint presentation in your board doc stuff. One shows a summary of the statutes regarding the bond proceeds, what we can buy, what we cannot buy, some timeline stuff. And the other is a list of tentative projects to be funded by bond proceeds in the next year. So most of this will just be like miscellaneous facts that when taken as a whole will kind of lead us to the decisions that need to be made. We passed our bond authorization on November 3rd, 2009, and the rest of this slide is pamphlet text. District expects to sell bonds over the next 6 years, and that's how long that authority lasts. So that would expire in November of 2015. The authorization is for $44 million, of which 39 is to renovate and construct school buildings, and $5 million is to improve and upgrade school facilities. And there is a 10% variance allowed by statute from that. So there's sort of three separate budgets that we'll look at in the coming slides. Total issuance, $44 million in June 2010. We issued half of that, so $22 million remains on the table per the authorization itself. Under the renovate and construct school buildings budget, we have built Papago School, and we also expanded Papago West to handle the students displaced by the rebuilding. So for constructing school buildings, we've spent $17.3 million of a $39 million budget. So remaining capacity is 21.7 roughly. Current balance is to upgrade school facilities. That budget's $5 million. We have spent 1.6. Each October, you may know, we present details for the prior year, exactly how that money was spent. So remaining budget capacity there is about 3.3 million. The 10% exception, we have spent a little bit of that, not very much, and so I show it here just because there's plenty of space to do so. A few things came up that total $33,500. So that 10% is based on proceeds, so there's $2.1 million left in that. But you need to note that this is not additional budget dollars, this is 10% of the proceeds that we have. So the cash balance, this slide presents the cash balance. I apologize, those at one time, those numbers were all lined up, but something happened in the translation here. So the $22 million in cash proceeds that we took in when we sold the bonds, there's a little variance for insurance rates between the time that you set and sell the bonds, so there's an extra $11,000 there. Renovate and construct $17 million we have spent. Improve and upgrade 1.6, and then the exception dollars, that leaves cash on hand of about $3 million. And if we subtract from that all the projects we expect to do next year, we would expect to have a cash balance of about $1.8 million at the end of that time. We we published in the pamphlet, and I believe that statute anyway, we reasonably expect to spend 85% of the proceeds in 3 years. So that would be a $3.3 million benchmark, which we will be below. But the point of this slide, or what it demonstrates to me, is that we have enough cash on hand to complete all the projects that we had planned on doing, and about $1.8 million to spare for contingency. Remaining authority, $22 million, that's the other half that is left unissued. And here is a floating kind of debt capacity under different scenarios, and it changes as time changes. Secondary assessed valuations for the coming year are published in January or February, and they become official in August. So each February we can see what the next year is going to look like capacity-wise. So right now we could today issue $2.8 million worth of bonds, and I think you all know the history that when a year or two before we went out for this authorization, our debt ceiling was in the neighborhood of $100 million. Assessed valuations in our district have fallen 30%, and that is the main piece of the formula that determines the debt ceiling, and so that's where we are now. After July 1st, we'll make a principal payment, and that frees up that same amount of capacity. That capacity will climb to $6.3 million. Those secondary assessed valuations for the coming year will become official the third week in August, and that will drop our capacity back down to $3.2 million because those valuations have fallen again. After July 1st, 2013, we'll make another payment, and that will raise our ceiling to $7 million. Beyond that, we're not sure because we don't know where valuations are going to go, and we don't know what 2013 legislation might be. So is it possible the capacity will not return before this authorization expires? That could be. That could happen. Could be the case. Some additional information. It costs about $50,000 to issue bonds, and that's not as a percentage because the same credit check has to be done, the same research has to be done, the same documents have to be produced, regardless of the size. We've already mentioned we have enough proceeds to do next year's projects. If we issue what we are allowed, and we did some more construction, just purely hypothetically, if we were to build rebuild our worst wing of classrooms, etc., it would be possible that there would not be enough money left to rebuild an entire school. Lastly, impact on the tax rates. As you know, bond proceeds, bond authorizations are funded entirely by the secondary property tax rate, and so that would absolutely raise our property taxes in the district. Also, we need to consider that the state has raised the qualifying tax rate again this year. The qualifying tax rate is the ratio of state dollars to local dollars that funds our M&O budget. So the higher that goes, the less state equalization money, the more primary property tax money. And so those bills are likely to go up again this year as they did last year. So it takes about 5 weeks to issue bonds, and that's kind of all of the data that one might want to look at in order to make that determination. And that's what we're throwing around now. Do you have questions about any of that?
Scott, we're not the only school that has bonds up for rebuilding or anything like that. So it's affecting all schools within the state. The evaluation of taxes.
Last I knew, there were about 15 districts in the same shoes that we are in with capacity on the table that was greater than what their their debt limit was. And there's been legislation brought forward in each of the last 2 sessions that didn't make it through for one reason or another. One on a technicality, and one I'm told because of heavy lobbying from utility companies. I don't know if that's true. That's what.
So basically, what you're saying is, in all probability, when these bonds were passed and the voters passed and we approved the voters passed, our goal was to look at Papago and maybe another school to rebuild, because most of our schools are, how do you put it, they're not only old, it's cheaper to rebuild than to renovate. So we were looking at 2 schools with these current bonds, right?
That's true, and that was the finding of the long-term facilities committee,
Right.
the rankings and such. Yeah.
But we weren't the only schools doing this, and now we turn up that we had one school, Papago's rebuild, and in all probability, we will not have, unless something passes in the legislature, we will not have the money to rebuild another school, even though originally that's where our plans with the money's allotted, correct? with
True.
bonds. But what I'm saying, we're not the only ones in this position that had the foresight, the idea that the bonds were for certain things. Other school districts had the same ideas, different money, maybe for renovations or something like that. So we're not the only ones like this with the decreasing.
Certainly not.
Okay. Are they doing anything in the legislature like lobbying, or is the legislature aware of where they put the school districts, not only ours but others, with this?
I'm aware of a person, superintendent at the Higley School District, who was organizing and trying to make an impact down there. I'm not sure what came of that.
What are the questions you alluded to? Questions that confront us and decisions that have to be made in the next few weeks.
Well, yeah, we can issue bonds anytime. It takes about 5 weeks to do so. But there's, you can see on this slide that the capacity bounces up and down. So it probably would be in that one of those 5-week windows from July 1st to mid-August that if someone were wanting to issue bonds, if we decide that's what we want to do, that would be the time to get meaningful proceeds. So that's what, now we're 5 to 10 weeks away from that. It would be time to think seriously about that.
Now, how is the tax rate of folks in this district, taxpayers in this district, affected by? Obviously, it's higher if we issue bonds than if we don't. But in terms of what it has been historically, would we be able to keep? Well, obviously, there are other factors going into people's property taxes, as you pointed out, the qualifying tax rate, valuations, etc. But I know we said when this was passed that basically it keeps the tax rates essentially where they had been because we'd paid off our debt. So in terms of keeping us at capacity, is there any other information that you can share about how tax rates for homeowners in this district would compare with if we were to go ahead and issue all of those bonds compared to what they've been in the past?
I will have that 2 board meetings from now specifically when we adopt a budget. Obviously, every dollar in bonds that we would issue would go into the tax rate, so this is all new. When we went out for this authorization, it was at the precise time that we were making the last payment on all the bonds that we had. So it wasn't all new. Half of it was a replacement, and the rest goes on the schedule.
That's right. It kept us below where we had been. It brought us up to where we were the previous year because it kind of came down and went back up.
Yeah. At a time when we're losing students, and so those new additions didn't really drive up the rate was falling mostly because values were increasing. The values determine your taxes versus yours, not so much what your tax bill is going to be. But yeah, they're rising. Creighton costs less to run, significantly less to run than it used to, but as the state has backed out a little bit, the local property tax bill has actually gone up.
So the bonding capacity, part of how that's determined does have to do with what the student enrollment is that correct?
Bonding capacity, no.
Okay. Sounded like you were
No,
mentioning that
yeah.
student enrollment had been declining.
That was kind of a global thing about the whole tax bill, because
gotcha.
student enrollment does impact our tax bill.
Sure, thank you.
Mr. Nolan, you may address the board. Please state your name and address and limit your presentation to the time allotted, which is 5 minutes.
Joe Nolan, patron, 3302 East Roma. Real quickly, all your questions tonight, while interesting, the only decision you have to make, are you going to bet on the come? Are you going to bet that you're going to have enough bonding capacity to build a school by 2015, hold off doing the other projects until that happens, or are you going to go ahead with the projects that you have scheduled? That's simple. 3 years ago when you guys were talking and you had the bond people here, I was at the mic, you weren't on the board at the time, Tiffany, and I said to the bond people, you won't have the capacity. And they said, yes, we will. And I said, will you guarantee that? And they kind of looked at me and laughed. Now, I can't believe I was the only one bright enough in the room to figure out what was going on in the economy and know that this whole plan was a house of cards. Your bond committee told you that or your bond company told you that your property value was going to go up 2% a year. It went down 34%, and as Scott when I had a conversation with him, so sarcastically put what she does so well, he goes, that's pretty good, they're only off 40%. So I certainly hope whoever's selling your bonds this time is not that same company. They do not deserve your business. Plain and simple. So it comes down to a lot of things, the way this district has managed the tax rates that affects their patrons. You had to know when the state was having its problems that the state was going to cut what they paid, hence property tax would go up for M&O. You had a list of $6 million in projects, and my question is, are those projects, of which I think $400,000 per site, roughly, give or take, and Roy, you can tell me, went to cabinetry? Is that still where the money's going to be spent? You had $130,000 to go to redoing the electrical panel at physical plant, but you did that before you sold the bonds. My understanding is that money is now not available to you. And I've asked for that clarification on that. I have not gotten it. So I guess what I'm saying to you is the decision that you have to make is, do you want to bet that you're going to get that property evaluation and hold off and build another school that you could even question whether that school, which I believe is going to be Mackin because the classrooms are too small, may even be necessary 2 or 3 or 4 years from now? Or do you want to go ahead and do those things that you told the people you were going to do with the money that's available to you? And if the legislature comes down and passes a deal, then you deal with it at that time. But you can't deal with what what may or may not happen. You have to deal with what you have and what you know today. And again, as a patron, I just really feel this district your leadership has botched this whole bonding and tax capacity because they hired somebody that was very poor at what she did, putting this bond together. They did not want to listen to anybody that disagreed with them. It was a committee made up of all district employees, that some of them happened to be district residents. And they never thought this thing through. But anyhow, that personal opinion being stated, again, I'll be redundant. The decision you have to make is real simple. It doesn't matter what the other districts got going on or anything. Are you going to bet on the come, or are you going to do those projects? And I also would like to know, Are those projects the ones that you gave the list to, Dr. Boyle, when you came out with this $6 million worth of projects? Because if they're not, you're going to have a problem, because it's already been challenged in court. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Nolan. And thank you, Scott, for your presentation. Now on to general agenda items.